President Trump didn't lower his voice when he said it. He pointed straight at the sentinel and barked, "Get him out of the shot!" When the guard didn't so much as blink, Trump repeated, sharper this time, "I said remove the guard." To him, it was just about optics. What he failed to ask was who he was ordering around. A US Army soldier who once carried his best friend's dog tags out of Helmand Province in a blood-soaked envelope, and hasn't missed a single watch since. But today, for the first time in 87 years of unbroken tradition, he broke silence. He asked for 60 seconds, and what he said in that single minute made even the president stop mid-sentence. Now, before we show you what happened next, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Let's get into it. You know that particular kind of spring day at Arlington, where the humidity hangs thick enough to taste? That's exactly what it was like on Memorial Day weekend, as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the white marble stones that stretch across the Virginia hills like a vast, silent army. The air itself felt reverent, heavy with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the weight of 400,000 stories buried beneath perfectly aligned headstones. Tour groups moved in hushed clusters, their voices automatically dropping to whispers as they passed through the wrought iron gates. Even the birds seemed to understand the rules here. At the heart of it all, where the marble steps rise toward the tomb of the unknown soldier, everything was exactly as it had been for nearly 9 decades. The black rope barriers held back a respectful crowd. Phones were lowered, cameras stayed silent. And on the platform above, a lone figure in dress blues maintained the most sacred watch in America. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had been walking those 21 steps for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. In summer heat that melted asphalt, through January blizzards that turned the marble into an ice rink. During Hurricane Isabel, when the wind nearly knocked him sideways, he'd never missed a step, never broken rhythm, never so much as flinched when protesters screamed in his face or tourists tried to make him laugh. If you looked at him from the crowd below, you'd see perfection. Dress blue uniform pressed to knife-edge creases, white gloves spotless, rifle positioned at the exact regulation angle. Every movement calculated to the split second, every turn executed with mechanical precision. But if you looked closer, you'd notice things that told a different story. The way he favoured his left leg, just slightly, compensating for the shrapnel still embedded in his hip. The faint scar that ran from his ear to his collar, barely visible beneath the high neckline of his uniform. The calloused hands beneath those pristine gloves, hands that had dug through rubble and carried stretchers and folded flags that would never fly again. Marcus Chen wasn't just another face under a military cap. At 28, he'd already lived enough for 3 lifetimes, growing up in a cramped apartment above his grandmother's restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, where she'd make him recite the names of relatives who'd died in wars he'd never heard of. "Remember," she'd say in broken English, "someone must always remember." His second life started at 18 when he joined the army, partly for the college money, mostly because his older brother Danny had come home from Iraq in a box draped with the same flag that now flew above his post. His third life began in Afghanistan's Kunar province, during an operation that was supposed to be routine. The IED that flipped their Humvee into a ravine killed 2 soldiers instantly and left their translator, a 20-year-old kid named Hamid who'd risked his life to help American forces, bleeding out in the wreckage. For 4 hours, Chen held pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, talking to Hamid about his sister's wedding, about the engineering degree he wanted to get, about anything except the fact that they were both probably going to die in that ditch. When the medevac finally arrived, Chen carried Hamid to the helicopter on his back, his own blood mixing with the translators on the desert floor. Hamid died 3 hours later at the field hospital. But before he went, he pressed something into Chen's hand, his sister's address in California, and a promise that someone would tell her how much her little brother had loved America. Chen still carried that address in his wallet, still sent birthday cards to a woman he'd never met, signed "A friend of your brother's." Still woke up some nights hearing Hamid laugh at terrible American jokes while his life leaked out through Chen's fingers. The commendation Chen received praised his extraordinary valor under fire, but the medal sat in a drawer at home. What he'd learned in that ditch couldn't be captured in bronze and ribbon. That standing watch wasn't about being seen. It was about being present when presence mattered. Which is why, when the black SUVs started rolling up the south entrance that Memorial Day afternoon, Chen didn't break his rhythm. 21 steps south, face the east. 21 seconds of stillness. Turn. 21 steps north. The Secret Service agents poured out first, scanning corners and speaking into their sleeves. Then came the press pool. Cameras already rolling, reporters adjusting their ties in the humid air. Finally, stepping onto the plaza with that unmistakable swagger, came the man himself. President Donald Trump emerged from the lead vehicle like he was arriving at a campaign rally, waving to the small crowd of staffers and press who'd gathered for the photo opportunity. His navy blazer was perfectly tailored, his red tie precisely knotted, his hair defying both gravity and the afternoon breeze. He moved with the confident stride of someone who'd never doubted that every room belonged to him. "Beautiful day for this," he said to his chief of staff, loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch. "Really beautiful. Perfect weather for honoring our heroes." The crowd behind the barriers had thickened. Tourists who'd recognized the motorcade, veterans who'd made pilgrimages for the holiday weekend, families teaching their children the meaning of sacrifice. A little girl in a red dress clutched her grandfather's hand, wide-eyed at the sudden commotion. An elderly woman in a Navy auxiliary jacket stood at attention, her eyes fixed not on the president, but on the lone guard who continued his solemn march. Trump climbed the marble steps with practiced political grace, pausing to shake hands with a Gold Star mother who'd been invited for the photo op. "Thank you for your son's service," he said, the words rolling off his tongue with the smooth polish of repetition. He was a hero, a real hero. But as he reached the top of the platform and positioned himself for the cameras, his attention shifted to something that hadn't been accounted for in the advance team's planning. Chen was mid-stride in his southern path, rifle at shoulder arms, eyes fixed on that distant point all tomb guards are trained to focus on. To the crowd below, he was part of the ceremony, as essential and immovable as the marble itself. But to a politician staging a photo opportunity, he was something else entirely. An obstruction. Trump squinted against the afternoon sun, then leaned toward his press secretary. "Can we move him out of the frame?" The press secretary, a sharp-eyed woman who'd been managing Trump's image for 6 months, looked confused. "Sir?" "The guard," Trump said, gesturing vaguely toward Chen. "He's right in the middle of the shot. Can we get him to step aside for a minute?" His chief of staff stepped closer, voice lowered. "Mr. President, this is Arlington. There are protocols." "Protocols?" Trump's eyebrows shot up. "I'm not asking him to do jumping jacks. Just move 10 feet to the left." Behind the press barriers, a retired Marine colonel felt his jaw tighten. He turned to his wife and said, loud enough for others to hear, 30 years I served. Never heard anything like this." A teacher from Virginia whispered to her husband, "Did he just ask them to move the tomb guard?" "That's what it sounded like," her husband replied, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ." A teenage boy visiting with his scout troop looked to his leader for explanation, but the man just shook his head slightly, his face grim. The press secretary cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Mr. President, that's the tomb sentinel. He's part of the ceremony. They don't typically—" "I understand what he is," Trump interrupted, his voice carrying that edge it got when he felt his authority being questioned. "I'm asking about moving him for 2 minutes so we can get a clean shot." An aide with a clipboard ventured carefully. "Sir, these guards, they take an oath, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They don't break protocol for anyone." Trump's head snapped toward the aide. "Anyone? I'm the commander-in-chief. I think that trumps whatever oath he took to play dress-up." From the crowd, an elderly woman in a Navy auxiliary jacket spoke up. "That's not dress-up, young man. That's honor." Trump either didn't hear her or chose to ignore her, but several people nearby nodded in agreement. A Gold Star mother adjusted her black pin and said quietly to her companion, "My son would be ashamed to hear this." Chen completed his southern path, executed his regulation turn, and began the walk north. 21 steps. Same as always, same as it had been since 1937. The ancient rhythm that connected him to every guard who'd walked this post before him through the Depression and World War II and Korea and Vietnam and 9/11 and everything since. Trump's irritation was growing. He'd expected this to be simple. Show up, say a few words about sacrifice and patriotism, pose for photos that would dominate the news cycle. Instead, he was being upstaged by what he clearly saw as a glorified statue. He turned to his head of security, a former Secret Service agent who'd been with him since the campaign. "I need you to ask him to step aside." The security chief looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm not sure we have the authority to—" "I'm the President of the United States," Trump said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the press pool. "I think I have the authority." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. This wasn't how these ceremonies went. This wasn't how anyone treated Arlington. The little girl in the red dress looked up at her grandfather with worried eyes. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" The old man who'd served in Vietnam and understood the weight of what they were witnessing just pulled her closer. "Some people don't understand respect, sweetheart." Chen reached the northern end of his path and began his turn. The movement was so precise, so perfectly controlled, that it seemed to mock the chaos of political theatre happening just yards away. He was operating on a different frequency entirely, one that had nothing to do with approval ratings or news cycles or photo opportunities. Trump's patience finally snapped. "Remove the guard," he said, loud enough for every microphone in the area to catch. Words echoed off the marble steps like a gunshot. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful quiet of ceremony. It was the stunned silence of a line being crossed in front of witnesses. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Camera operators looked up from their viewfinders. Even the Secret Service agents looked uncomfortable. A woman near the Eastern Barrier gasped audibly. A veteran in a wheelchair felt his hands clench into fists. Someone's phone buzzed with an incoming text, and they quickly silenced it, suddenly aware that even that small sound felt like a violation. From the press pool, a CNN correspondent whispered urgently to her cameraman, "Are you getting this?" A photographer from the Post lowered his camera, as if recording the moment would somehow make him complicit in it. The security chief took a reluctant step toward Chen, clearly hoping the guard would somehow resolve this situation himself. But Chen just continued his march, as unresponsive to the chaos around him as he was to everything else that had tried to break his concentration over the years. That's when Trump decided to address Chen directly. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying that tone of forced patience he used when dealing with people he considered beneath him. "Excuse me." Chen completed another turn, began another path. 21 steps south. The same steps he'd walked through thunderstorms and protests, through moments of personal grief and national tragedy. The steps that connected him to something larger than politics or personality. Trump's face flushed. In a career built on commanding attention and controlling narratives, he'd never encountered someone who simply refused to acknowledge his presence. "I'm talking to you," he said, louder now. "The guard, in the costume." The word hit the assembled crowd like a slap. A gold star father removed his hat and held it over his heart, as if saluting not just the guard, but the principle he represented. A group of tourists from Germany looked confused. This wasn't the America they'd come to see. Trump took a step closer to the rope barriers, his voice carrying across the plaza. "You going to stand there like a mannequin all day, or are you going to acknowledge your commander-in-chief?" It happened between heartbeats. Chen reached the southern end of his path, began his regulation turn, and stopped. Not a pause, not a hesitation, a complete break in the rhythm that had continued uninterrupted for decades. The crowd didn't understand what they were seeing at first. To most visitors, it might have looked like a normal ceremonial pause. But to the veterans present, to anyone who'd ever witnessed the changing of the guard, it was earth-shattering. Tomb guards didn't stop. Not for weather, not for emergencies, not for presidents. Chen turned to face Trump directly, and for the first time in 3 years of standing this post, his eyes weren't fixed on that distant point of military focus. They were looking at a man who just demanded he abandon his sacred duty for a photo opportunity. Slowly, deliberately, Chen took one step forward. The collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible. Cameras that had been lowered suddenly snapped back up. The press pool surged forward against their barriers. "Holy shit," someone whispered from the press section. "Language," a mother hissed, but her eyes never left Chen. A veteran in a wheelchair felt his hands shake. "In 30 years of coming here," he said to his wife, "I've never seen a guard break formation. Not once." "Should we be filming this?" a young reporter asked her cameraman. "Are you kidding me?" he replied, adjusting his lens. "This is history." 60 seconds, Mr. President, Chen said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that real power didn't need to shout. "Then I'll return to post." His words cut through the humid air like a blade through silk. Trump's expression shifted from irritation to something that might have been surprise. He'd expected compliance or silence. He hadn't expected to be addressed by someone who clearly felt no need to defer to his authority. "Oh?" Trump said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow against the marble steps. "Now he talks? The statue finally comes to life?" He gestured toward the press pool with theatrical flair. "This should be good, folks. Let's see what the tin soldier has to say." But Chen wasn't performing for the cameras or playing to the crowd. He stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, speaking as if he were alone with the dead he'd sworn to guard. "I've walked these 21 steps through 3 winters and 4 summers," he began, his voice steady and clear. "In snow that made the marble slick as glass, through heat that made tourists faint, during thunderstorms that sent everyone else running for cover." Trump opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in Chen's bearing made him pause. "I've walked them while protesters screamed that soldiers were murderers, while drunk college kids tried to climb the barriers, while a man with a gun got past security and made it halfway up these steps before they stopped him." A security agent in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, remembering, "And I never broke stride, not once, because this isn't about me." Chen reached into his breast pocket, slowly, respectfully, and withdrew a worn envelope. The paper was soft with age, stained with sweat, and folded so many times it barely held together. "This is a letter from my platoon mate, Danny Rodriguez," he said, holding it carefully in one gloved hand. "He wrote it 3 days before his convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. 7 soldiers died that day. Danny was 22. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the Secret Service agents had stopped speaking into their radios. Danny wanted to be a teacher when he got home. Had a girlfriend named Sarah who sent him pictures of the classroom she was setting up for him. He carried those pictures in his helmet. Chen's voice never wavered, but something in his eyes suggested the cost of that control. "When the explosion happened, I dug through the wreckage for 6 hours looking for survivors. Found Danny pinned under a piece of armor plating, still breathing, still asking if Sarah would wait for him." Trump's staff had gone completely still. A few were staring at their shoes, as if witnessing something too intimate for public consumption. "He died holding my hand," Chen continued. "Last thing he said was that he hoped someone would remember the guys who didn't make it home." He carefully folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. "That's why I stand here. Not for photo opportunities, not for politics, for Danny Rodriguez and all the others whose names we'll never know." The silence stretched across the plaza like morning fog. Every person buried in this ground died believing in something bigger than themselves. They didn't ask for cameras or credit or recognition. They just served. And now they can't speak for themselves anymore. Chen looked directly at Trump, meeting his gaze without flinching. "So I stand silent in their honor, because silence isn't weakness. It's respect. And some things are more important than being seen." He paused, letting the words settle into the heavy air. "I'm not a decoration, Mr. President. I'm a promise. A promise that as long as there are guards like me, the fallen will never be forgotten." Another pause, briefer this time. "And I don't break promises." With that, Chen executed a perfect about face and returned to his position. The movement was so precise, so absolutely controlled, that it seemed to restore order to the universe itself. 21 steps south, face the east. Hold for 21 seconds. The ancient rhythm resumed, as if it had never been interrupted. But everything had changed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, charged with recognition and respect and the understanding that everyone present had just witnessed something they would carry with them forever. From somewhere in the crowd, a woman began to cry. Soft, respectful tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. "God damn," a Marine veteran whispered to his buddy. "That's what it means to serve." "Hoorah," his friend replied quietly. Near the eastern barrier, a teenage boy who'd been fidgeting throughout the ceremony now stood perfectly still. "Mom," he whispered, "I want to do that someday." His mother squeezed his hand. "Then you better learn what honor means first." A gold star. Father stepped closer to the barrier. "That's how you honor the fallen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not with politics, with truth." From the press section, a seasoned war correspondent who'd covered conflicts in 12 countries felt tears on her cheeks. "In 20 years of reporting," she said to her producer, "I've never heard anything like that." A retired Air Force colonel who'd been visiting with his family slowly removed his hat and held it over his heart. His wife did the same. Then their children. The gesture spread through the crowd like ripples on still water, not orchestrated, just instinctive. Even some of Trump's own staff seemed moved. His press secretary had stopped taking notes and was just watching Chen walk his eternal path. A Secret Service agent who'd served 3 tours in Iraq stood a little straighter. Trump himself seemed at a loss. For perhaps the first time in his political career, he'd encountered someone who'd commanded a room not through volume or charisma, but through quiet dignity and absolute moral clarity. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Well," he said, his voice carrying less confidence than before, "that was certainly dramatic." The forced chuckle that followed fell flat. None of his staff joined in. The press pool remained silent. Even the tourists seemed to understand that laughter would be a violation. Trump tried again, gesturing toward Chen's position. Good voice on him. Very theatrical, like something from a movie. "Sir," his chief of staff whispered urgently, "maybe we should—" "I'm handling this," Trump snapped back. Then louder to the crowd, "Look, I appreciate passion. I really do. But we're here for a photo opportunity, not a one-man show." A voice from the crowd cut through his words. "Show some respect." Trump paused, scanning the faces to find the source. "Excuse me?" An older man in a Vietnam veteran's cap stepped forward. "I said show some respect. That soldier just gave you more truth than you've heard in years." "Sir, you need to step back," a Secret Service agent warned. The veteran raised his hands but didn't retreat. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just saying what everyone here is thinking." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "He's right," someone else called out. "Listen to what the man said." But the words sounded hollow and mean-spirited against the backdrop of what they'd just heard. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "Jesus," under their breath. Sensing that he was losing the room, Trump attempted a different approach. "Look, I respect the sentiment," he said, adopting the tone he used when trying to appear magnanimous. "I really do. We all honor our veterans. That's why we're here today." But his words felt scripted and empty compared to the raw honesty they'd just witnessed. Near the press barrier, the CNN correspondent was frantically typing notes on her phone. This wasn't the story she'd come to cover. This was something else entirely. A moment when ceremony and politics had collided and ceremony had won. A photographer from Reuters lowered his camera, as if recognizing that some moments were too sacred to capture for public consumption. Trump made one more attempt to reclaim the narrative. "Of course, we need to maintain proper protocols," he said, his voice carrying that edge of authority he fell back on when feeling challenged. "This is still a military ceremony. There are proper channels for expressions of opinion." But even as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting back to Chen, who continued his march with the same perfect precision as before. Unmoved, unaffected, utterly committed to something larger than the petty dynamics of political theatre. The crowd began to shift restlessly. What was supposed to be a brief photo opportunity had become something else entirely. Parents were explaining to children what they'd just witnessed. Veterans were standing straighter. Tourists were putting away their cameras, as if recognizing that some moments demanded presence rather than documentation. Trump's chief of staff appeared at his elbow, whispering urgently about schedules and damage control. But the president seemed frozen, caught between his instinct to fight back and his growing realization that he'd already lost this battle. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stepped away from the microphones. "Thank you all for coming," he said in the clipped tone of a man ending a meeting that hadn't gone his way. "Let's honor our veterans by respecting their service." The irony of the words wasn't lost on anyone present. As Trump's entourage began to move toward the waiting vehicles, many in the crowd remained behind. They stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd just witnessed. "Did you get that on video?" one person asked another. "Every word," came the reply. "My son's unit served with guys like that. He needs to see this." A college student turned to her friend. "I thought this was just going to be boring political stuff. That was... holy shit. That was a masterclass in dignity," her friend replied. Near the Eastern Barrier, the Marine veteran who'd spoken earlier was explaining to a group of younger people who'd gathered around him. "You want to know what leadership looks like? What you just saw. No yelling, no theatrics, just truth delivered with honor." "Is that normal?" a tourist asked. "Do the guards usually speak?" The veteran shook his head. "In 87 years, I have never heard of a tomb guard breaking protocol like that. That man risked his entire career to make a point." "What point?" "That some things are more important than politics. Some things are sacred." An elderly woman approached the barrier and placed a small American flag pin at the base. "For Danny Rodriguez," she said quietly, then walked away before anyone could ask her name. The little girl in the red dress tugged on her grandfather's sleeve. "Why did that soldier make the loud man stop talking, Grandpa?" The old veteran looked down at his granddaughter with eyes that had seen enough wars to understand what courage looked like. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, the quietest people have the most important things to say." "Will he get in trouble?" Her grandfather watched Chen continue his eternal march, unmoved by the chaos that had swirled around him. "Maybe," he said, "but some things are worth getting in trouble for." Chen continued his walk, 21 steps north, turn, 21 steps south. The rhythm that had sustained this place through decades of change and challenge, through wars and peace, through the rise and fall of political careers. As Trump's motorcade pulled away from Arlington, leaving behind only exhaust fumes and the lingering weight of an uncomfortable truth, Chen walked on. Not because he was ordered to, not because he was paid to, but because he'd made a promise to remember those who couldn't remember themselves. And in a world full of noise and spectacle and manufactured outrage, that promise felt more important than any photo opportunity ever could. The tourists eventually dispersed. The press packed up their equipment. The security barriers were moved aside. But Chen remained, walking his eternal path, keeping his silent vigil, standing watch over the unknown soldiers who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return, just as he had yesterday, just as he would tomorrow, just as guards like him would continue to do long after the politicians and their photo opportunities had been forgotten. Because some promises are bigger than politics, and some silences speak louder than any speech ever could. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone stand up to power, not with anger, but with quiet dignity? Should there be places and moments that remain sacred no matter who's present? And what would you have done if you'd been standing in that crowd, watching history unfold? Thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and conversations like these remind us why stories like this matter. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand for what's right, hit that like button. It helps more people see stories that need to be told. Make sure you're subscribed and ring that notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Real courage happens every day, and we're here to share every moment of it. And if you know someone who needs to remember what true strength looks like, someone who could use a reminder that dignity always defeats bluster, share this video with them. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. The quietest voices often carry the most weight. And when duty calls, some people answer, no matter who's watching.